Hi, everybody. My name is Rhonda Seelinger, and I'm the event manager for Sky Factor. And I just want to thank you so much for spending some time with us today. We are going to begin very soon. Just wanted to let everybody know, I think you probably already do know this, but you're on mute, and that doesn't mean we don't want to hear from you, but that does help us keep out background noise. The way that we typically communicate is using the chat feature. You might see the little menu where it says chat. And you're welcome to type anything in there if you have questions, if you want to make a comment. And I'll be monitoring that for Dr. Woosley throughout the presentation. And I promise that we will get to everything in good time. I do also want to let everyone know that we are recording this. So no need to write notes furiously or whatever. We will be sending a link to the recording within a day or two, usually after the session. So with that, I am very pleased to introduce Dr. Sherry Woosley, who is the Director of Analytics and Research for Sky Factor, and she is going to be leading us through the Avoiding Assessment Pitfalls seminar right now.
Thanks, Rhonda. Welcome, everybody. We have an interesting conversation today. What we're going to be talking about is those kind of pitfalls or missteps, and what I mean by that in terms of assessment is the things that we do, and I say we because Lord knows I've done them too, is those things that we do sometimes that limit the potential value or impact of assessment. And so what I want to do is talk about those, but also talk about then how to avoid them. And I'm going to kind of interchangeably probably use the words pitfalls or missteps, and that'll be the focus today. So this is not a data talk. This is much more of a kind of conceptual best practices kind of conversation today. And the plan is to sort of group these missteps or pitfalls into three kinds of categories. And the first one are the ones that I kind of call the building blocks. Those are the foundational kinds of missteps that maybe we make either early on or through the whole project that can limit again, the value that we get out of assessment. If we're going to spend time working assessment, doing assessment, planning assessment, we need to make sure that there is an impact, and we want to maximize that as much as we can. We're also going to talk about some of those missteps or pitfalls that may happen in the planning phases and the kind of conducting assessment activities, and then finally more in the reporting and evaluation. So maybe once we get information back, what do we do with it, and how can those decisions or activities limit the value that we get out of the effort of assessment? I wanted to do a quick little kind of shout out thank you to Amanda Knurr. We did a similar presentation a number of years ago, and there's no question that when you work with a partner that their expertise, their experience, their thinking influences how you think. And so I know the conversations we had when we did this type of a presentation before have influenced what you see here. And I want you all to know that she contributed. And if you're from Indiana State, maybe you know her, that's where she is now. So plan, missteps, pitfalls, and how do we avoid them? Again, when you think about kind of what am I talking about, I mean, think about your own assessment projects or assessment projects you've seen on your campus, in presentations, in your own department, and think about the missteps maybe that you've seen, or the pitfalls that people have kind of stumbled into, and what kinds of things are preventing assessment from really impacting practice, whether it's isolated or whether it's not paid attention to. What are those things that are creating a pitfall or a chasm between assessment and our activities and our work that we do on a daily basis? And even that sort of final thing, why isn't assessment always or consistently viewed as useful? Or what's making people believe that it's not useful, that it's an add-on and not part of the work that we do. So again, think about your campus, your division, your department, even your own work, because I think we've all been in situations where either we had grand plans or we even went in believing that this would have an impact and it didn't. And what are the things that create that lack of insight, impact, whatever word you want, okay? So let's start with kind of the building blocks, or those kinds of foundational thoughts, feelings, assumptions that can create limitations in the impact of assessment. So I would say number one, and this is so common, misstep number one is that we conduct assessment just so we can say we're conducting it. It becomes this check-off box. We need to conduct assessment, so we thought we'd do a survey. Or we have to, as part of our planning process, say what assessment we're doing. The conversation that I remember having, particularly when I was in assessment and institutional research, kind of on a campus on a daily basis, the conversation often felt kind of like, hey, somebody would come in and they'd say, hey, we need to begin doing some assessment. And we'd like your help with a survey. And so the implication is not that I necessarily want to do better at my job, but that I have this mandate, external, internal, whatever, kind of prompting me to do this. Or the conversation might even be like, we have to show we're effective, so we're going to collect some data. So I'm not necessarily doing it to improve practice. I'm doing it because I need to be able to say I'm doing it. Oftentimes this misstep can also come about because of an external mandate. My whoever title, supervisor, dean, department chair, thinks we should be doing some. Somebody wants to see the results. So that notion of we're just going to do it so that we can show them that we're doing it, right? And you can imagine why that's going to cause some issues for having it be impactful. If I'm only doing it to check the box, if I'm only doing it to tell somebody I'm doing it, my investment, my motivation, my likelihood of paying attention to the results is significantly lower, right? A related misstep that can play the same way is that we just plain fail to connect it to practice. That scenario where maybe we're doing something that is interesting rather than truly useful. So the conversations that happen around this misstep or this pitfall sound something more like, well, it's time to do some assessment, so let's do some assessment. And maybe we'll take, April to do it because it's a little bit quieter. Not a sense of what do we want to learn and what's the good time to get that information. There's not that sort of natural link between what we're doing. So by making these kinds of missteps, whether it's doing it to check the box or doing it and not making that link to practice, you can imagine it would lessen its impact. One of the other ways that I guess this misstep plays out is sometimes we put assessment in a separate committee or a separate person, and we could disconnect it from curriculum, from program planning, and we have it be this other person's job. That can be a way we absolutely isolate assessment, and therefore it's our ability to make assessment impact practice is more difficult. Because it's a separate person, because it's a separate committee, we've automatically built in a chasm, a communication gap at some level that can limit its impact. So if we want to avoid these two missteps, at some level, it's kind of obvious what we should do. We really should be thinking about assessment projects that are purposeful, useful, and reflective. One of the things I love, Randy Swing, who is kind of one of the great speakers of assessment that I've seen. I mean, he more than 10 years ago had this great quote about, we plain just shouldn't do assessment unless it reinforces our current practice, meaning that it tells us what we're doing well and that it's working. Or the other hand for him was it helps us to shape how we should change practice. It should provide us guidance on what to do different. And I think that's fundamentally what it should be. And if it's not, and he even said it, we're wasting people's time, energy, and attention. And so when you think about assessment and making it purposeful, that means that we're going to think about it, we're going to plan it, we're going to make those connections to practice, and we're going to do it from the very get-go. We're going to be thinking about what's our purpose, how is this data, this information we're collecting going to be useful, and how is it going to get us to reflect on our curriculum, our goals, our implementation of things, and how are we going to make sure that that's part of what we're doing. One of the things I would say too, which I think is really interesting, is I've had and worked with groups who get grants. And grants often have an assessment component. And so what you'll see is these kind of missteps happen because we're so focused on the grant and the program that we're creating. And then we go, oh, we need assessment, and we don't always make this good link because we have to do the assessment to get the grant and to keep the grant. But there's no reason that assessment can't have serious insights and impact for us as we try to create the program and evolve the program, particularly multi-year grants. So sort of the other thing to kind of be thinking about is when we're thinking about planning purposeful assessments, useful assessments, is this notion of thinking about the potential uses before you begin doing it. How might I use survey data to impact curriculum, to impact program goals? Because that's going to start driving even the questions that we ask, and that's going to start making those links. Thinking about what are the goals of the program? What are we trying to do with the program? And then how do we make sure that those goals are included in our assessment? And then trying to figure out ways to really collect useful data that maybe could be used in training, could be used in the development of curriculum and program goals, that could be used in a variety of different ways. Even if a grant program says you need these 3 pieces of data, are there a couple extras that would be particularly useful and that would provide additional value so that the assessment has value beyond just providing the 3 numbers, beyond just providing that kind of checked off box, okay? Hopefully that one was pretty obvious. Let's talk about a couple other building block missteps. This one I love, and I love this guy. He's awesome, isn't he? I think we've seen him at the back of all kinds of different rooms. But this is a foundational kind of misstep in that we let our enthusiasm based on a workshop or a book or something propel us to the level of trying to be an expert. Okay, and the reason that I think this misstep really came up for me or became kind of obvious for me is I had been doing focus groups for years. I had read, I don't know how many different books, everything else, and I had been working on training some graduate students to do focus groups, and one of whom went to a conference and saw a presentation on focus groups. And she came back and she said, oh my gosh, they were training people how to do focus groups and they missed it. And so I think what happens sometimes is we go to a session on a method and then we think that we're all ready to run. And it's very important to understand that a presentation can absolutely get your motivation going. It can absolutely lay the foundation for what you might want to do, but it doesn't necessarily make you an expert. And you need to double or triple check the quality of the work that you've just learned from, right? Not all presentations are equal. If they're telling you things about focus groups that are going to make your focus group less valuable and you don't have the background to spot that or know that, you can actually create work for yourself that makes assessment difficult. Okay, there's no question, you know, that one presentation doesn't make you an expert. Not all presentations are created equal. And even a good presentation, if it's the first time you've been exposed to a method, an hour is probably not the depth that you need. There's no question they write whole books about focus groups, tons of books. They write whole books about survey design, let alone survey analysis. So again, things get you excited doesn't mean that you're ready to run on ahead. The other thing is that everyone's situation is different. So that presenter at the front of the room, including me, may be talking about experiences based on the students that I've worked with, the campuses that I've worked with. And that may or may not apply to your particular assessment project. It may not be a good fit. And so if you make decisions solely based on my experience, you actually might make a misstep, if that makes some sense. And frankly, assessment isn't super simple. There are some complexities, there is some depth, and I don't mean to discourage you from doing it because I think it is amazingly powerful. I just ask that you kind of put a little bit of caution onto the motivation, particularly when you come out of a good presentation and you're all excited. There's no question that expertise requires training and time. What is it, Malcolm Gladwell and his 10,000 hours? So I'm not saying you got to do 10,000 hours before you do a focus group, but spend some time up front, front load some of the work to make sure that your focus group or your survey is going to get you information that you can trust, that will be solid and useful. Make assessment a part of what you do, because then you'll build the time. Do a little mini survey here. Look at classroom assessment techniques as a way to try different questions so you can see what works for soliciting feedback. Do some little things to kind of work your skill set up, and utilize your resources, whether that's, the conference presentations, other textbooks, online materials, professionals around you, help out with some here or there so that you build your expertise and capture the motivation to move you forward. So, wow, that was a soapbox. Sorry about that. But anyway, number 4, kind of related, is sometimes the reason assessment lacks impact is because we do it in isolation. We develop a survey, we get some interesting results, and then we try to sell those results to the people that can make a difference. When in fact, that's probably not the best way to build buy-in. The other thing is it's not the best way to ensure that the results are going to be useful, because other people who are working with that program goals may have other insights that could have made that assessment more valuable. This is, I think, particularly true for folks that are new to assessment or new to their position or their programs. And frankly, if you're new, the workload associated with some of these things, particularly doing them in isolation, can be overwhelming. So there's no question that having some other folks help can be an improvement. There's always a learning curve, so isolating is probably not the best way to deal with that. The other thing I think, too, is that in many of our departments, we may have multiple assessment projects that fail or do not have impact, or that are going at the same time, and so people can get discouraged. And if you're isolated, it's even easier to get discouraged. And because isolation doesn't include that variety of perspectives, you're going to miss out on some stuff. So you know what the obvious solution here is. It really is about collaborating and finding those folks to help. Collaborators add motivation and they add expertise. They reduce the workload. So there's no question having a conversation, like I mentioned, Amanda, at the beginning, increased the likelihood that this kind of presentation would get done and get delivered, and that would impact what we're doing down the line. And skill development through those conversations is a good thing. Working with assessment experts in your area can be, or even in other areas on campus, can help promote not only successful assessment projects, but even some of the visibility of those pieces. And a small assessment project that is really successful speaks to the office and the department and the ability to motivate others to get involved even more, and to do assessment regularly and have it have impact. So there's no question kind of collaboration can create some really wonderful things. Some some real concrete things, if you want to know kind of how you start with collaboration, there's no question it's seeking out information and people. So finding those resources, using multiple resources. Again, if you're going to do focus groups, there's lots of books out there. And different books can tell you different things, and you can start to get a sense. And I would encourage folks to look outside your field. Not only to get those in your field, but marketing has been using focus groups for decades. They have a different kind of approach sometimes than we might in assessment circles, and it's good to get that kind of insight, and it can make you think maybe differently about what you're doing. I would also say, find those assessment experts on your campus. There's lots of folks out there who do this kind of work, who may be doing it as consultants, or may just be sort of super interested in how students think about things, or what our programs are doing. Educational experts often fall into this, and using multiple resources, multiple perspectives can absolutely impact the quality of our assessment, as well as its ultimate usefulness and the extent to which it is used. So I just went through kind of building blocks, those foundational things, making sure that you understand, that there's other folks around there that can work with you, to help you, to have conversations. Even just assessment brown bag lunches where people talk about the different projects that they're working on to share ideas can be hugely impactful to the quality of the assessment and its impact. But let's talk about some things maybe that aren't foundational, that happen in the planning and conducting of assessment. So let's say we're in or beginning the nitty-gritty of the details of what we want to do and how we want to either assess learning or satisfaction or needs. We're getting ready to start the kind of race, if you will. What kinds of missteps or pitfalls do we want to kind of be watching for, and what might we do about them? The first one I think is a really simple one, but it's one you see a lot, is we rush. We rush into conducting assessments. We almost rush through the planning stages. We're so excited about assessment, or we so badly want the data, or in many cases we got overloaded in the planning times and this project didn't seem as urgent as it suddenly now does. When I worked in assessment offices, it was not unusual for folks to come in and I need to have assessment data by the end of the semester, and it's April. So sometimes we're rushing, and there's no question that that's going to, limit our, if you think back to some of the previous words we used, limit our thoughtfulness, our purposefulness, and our ability to make these things useful. And so fundamentally, the solution to that is, take a breath and create some sort of a plan. And you do want it to be as thorough or well organized as you can. And what that might mean is scaling back on the extent of assessment that you wanted to do, that we're going to do a slightly smaller project, but we're going to plan it a little bit better, or we're going to put it into some sort of a plan that will help us, breathe and be thoughtful about what we're doing. One thing to watch when you're looking at kind of assessment resources, or even thinking about assessment and assessment plans, is there's really kind of two levels of planning that happen around assessment, both of which are important. And what you want to think about is there's departmental plans. They can also be divisional plans, but like a group plan of all the assessments that are maybe happening in an area. So it's going to show multiple kinds of assessment. It may show cycles of assessment. So we're going to do this survey every other year. On the off years, we're going to do these other sort of projects. It also answers oftentimes key questions. If I have a set of 5, 7, 8 learning goals, I'm going to show over the course of these timelines, as well as multiple assessments, how we're hitting every one of those 8 goals, and where and for whom, and with what kinds of projects. The beauty of those kinds of departmental plans is that they kind of lay out the who, what, why, where, when stuff, and by doing that, you start to see duplication. And you see duplication not only of efforts. Maybe that, man, we're surveying our students a lot, but you also see duplication of topics, or duplication of timing, or duplication even of ideas, or duplication of methods. We're doing a lot of surveys. We're not doing any focus groups. We're doing a lot about learning, but we forgot about needs, or we forgot about satisfaction, or we forgot about asking about some of the experiences and true more activity stuff. And so a departmental plan can help us as we're rushing to do something to kind of take a step back. And by taking that step back and eliminating the duplications, you can actually kind of reduce some of the workload sometimes. The other kind of plan, which is probably more of what you thought of when I said we rush, is an individual plan. I don't mean an individual person, I mean an individual assessment project. So what you do on an individual plan is you kind of lay out the specifics of that particular assessment activity. What are we trying to measure? How are we going to measure it? From whom? The timing. Who's responsible for what? What resources are we going to do? What reports are we going to put out, and to whom? And so you start laying out the specifics of that assessment project in the beginning. This can be critical for kind of addressing even some of those foundational missteps of, how are we going to make this useful? Well, we're going to plan it, and we're going to think about who might use the data, and when might they need it, and are we going to be ready for it? It gives that opportunity for reflection that without a plan, you might not get to. You might say, oh, the reporting, that'll come later. I don't need to worry about that now. Whereas if you're laying out a plan, you'll be thinking about that and starting to put those on paper. The other thing that a plan really does, and hopefully we all know this, is it really helps ensure a more successful project because we've thought things through, we know who's responsible, we figure out the gaps ahead of time, and we start to see that, oh, as we lay this out, man, we were going to try and do the survey at this point, but man, that might hit spring break, we don't want to do that. Or those kinds of issues we start to see with a plan. So one of the other sort of missteps, and this goes along the lines with some of those useful things I said before, but this can happen absolutely as you begin planning and conducting assessment, is that it somehow gets disconnected from the program goals. That something becomes interesting. So wouldn't it be interesting if we did assessment about whatever the topic is, but it's not really something we're trying to accomplish. And so although it's interesting and although we might learn something from it, it is less likely to have an impact on what we do. One of the ones I remember is I remember having a conversation with folks and about they wanted to know whether SAT was related to study hours. It's a very interesting topic at some level. Do students who score well study more or do they study less? And that might help us, understand students a little bit, maybe. But fundamentally, if you're doing study skills workshops, are you going to do your study skills workshops different with that information? Or are there other things that would actually be more helpful to understand about study behaviors when you're thinking about that? So I think one of the questions that we need to be thinking about when we think about this is, what are the goals that we're trying to accomplish, and are we asking assessment questions related to those goals, right? A similar kind of related misstep is that collecting of interesting data. If we're collecting things that are interesting that aren't useful, we're going to kind of miss the mark, right? I think some of the questions that I've heard go through many of our higher ed circles over the last, 5, 10 years are these questions. What is it that we say we are doing? We're teaching students what? We're providing good service in these ways. We're providing accurate information in our particular student support role. What is it that we say we're doing? Because once you kind of lay that out, then you start trying to ask assessment questions that are, if we say we're teaching this, how do we know we're teaching it? Or how can we create an assessment that can show us we are doing, in fact, what we say we're doing? And then finally, sort of what would what kinds of information could we look at in assessment that would help us accomplish that better. Those questions may be things like, okay, we're trying to teach students this. We could ask questions about, are all of our students learning that? Are all of our students learning that at similar levels? We could also ask questions about the methods. When we try to, get our students to learn this using this method, is it as effective as some other method? And part of that, if you think, I think sometimes when I talk learning, people think I'm talking academics, and I am. I mean, there's no question that, how we present and engage materials in the classroom and engage our students can have impacts on learning. But those same questions apply in a lot of our support areas and a lot of our student affairs areas. If we're trying to teach our students particular behaviors, if we're trying to expose them to different things, how are we doing that? And how are we knowing, or how do we know that this particular method of doing it may be better or as effective as another particular method? Those are all great assessment questions that if we can start pulling apart and getting that information could impact what we do, whether it's in the classroom or in the hallway or in programs or even in our interactions with students. All right, one other kind of layout of if you're planning and conducting assessment. This one is so common that it's almost funny. We choose the method before we choose the purpose. This one was very common in an assessment office. People would call me into committees or call me into a meeting, and they would say, Sherry, we want you to help us design a survey. Best case scenario is they had goals, they knew why, they knew what they wanted students to learn, how to measure it, everything else. What was a lot more common was something like, we want to do a survey to find out whatever it may be. So let's use learning again. We want to find out what students are learning in this particular program, in the residence halls, in this particular course. We want to know what they're learning. Well, I think one of the fundamental questions is, what are you trying to teach or get students to learn, and how can we measure that? But one of the other questions is, will a survey really capture the complexity of learning that occurs in that program or that environment? And in some cases, the answer is yes, and a survey may be an entirely appropriate method. But in some cases, it might not be. And if you ask, too, the next question about how are you going to use this information, it may be that we need to understand how students are learning. And if we start needing to understand how they're learning, a survey may or may not work, or it may or may not be the best choice. So I think that asking some of those questions about what we want to know and the purpose of our study and using the answers to those to guide our method choices can be really powerful. Another example I have is I remember having a conversation with a group who really wanted to do focus groups about student attitudes towards sexual activity. And so we had to have some conversations about, is the purpose of that to draw generalizations? Because if it is, then a focus group might not be the best way. Focus groups, you don't talk to as many students. Our ability to understand how representative this focus group is of other focus groups, it's just not a good purpose method fit. And if we want to know how they make decisions, then a focus group actually might be a great way to understand the depth of the decision making and to be able to follow up on things. But then there's some other questions about students and their comfort to talk in focus groups. And so we need to make sure that we've really thought through the purpose and what we want to learn before we choose our method. And so I think some of the questions that should be guiding the method choice are things like, what do you want to do with the information? What audience are you going to be talking to? And are they going to respond to kind of the information that you're thinking about, which we'll also talk about in the reporting in just a bit. But, what do you plan to do with it? What information is essential for you to understand and answer the kinds of questions you're trying to answer? Who has the information, and what's the best way to get it from them? And this becomes really interesting when you start talking about things like alumni. or maybe off-campus students or folks that are a little tougher to get a hold of? Is that going to impact things? But a clear purpose to the assessment project can absolutely help clarify the methodological, that's my big word for today, methodological decisions that you're making. Oftentimes we're so used to doing surveys and we have a comfort with surveys, so we jump to surveys before we've had the purpose discussion that should guide this. Hope that makes sense. So let's talk a little bit about kind of after you have the information, what kinds of pitfalls or missteps happen in the sort of reporting and evaluating of an assessment project. Because there's just a couple here, but I think that they can be critical. You can create an assessment project with a very clear purpose, very clear link to goals. You can plan it well, choose a strong methodology, and do a really great job, and still have it end up in a report that sits on somebody's shelf, right? And fundamentally, what that typically means is that our sharing mechanism is ineffective. Oh, look at that, I have a typo, sorry. It should say your report results. Oh no, it's you report results ineffectively. So it's right. I didn't have a typo. Sorry. So it's that notion of you report out the results, you share the results in a way that doesn't move people. And this can look a lot of different ways. This can be the notion of Schuh and Upcraft. I love this quote, and it's getting so dated, I'm going to need a new one. But I mean this notion of it ends up on somebody's shelf, it ends up in a binder, because we fail to package the results in a way that moves decision makers. So, I mean, if you think about this can be a matter of something gets buried, somebody doesn't have the time to look at it, and we've designed a full report when what they needed was bullet points. This can also be that you take assessment results into a committee, and the committee gets focused for an hour on conversations, but it never connects to practice, and so they walk out, and it was an interesting conversation, but it didn't make it. It could also be that we all look at it and we get discouraged, and therefore we don't make any changes. So there's a lot of reasons that our sharing, I kind of like the word sharing mechanism, because I don't think it has to be a report. I think we're getting much more creative about how we share data, and I'm seeing all kinds of really great things. I mean, not only some of the fabulous infographics that we're seeing, but even, you know, people putting little data tidbits on agendas, putting data tidbits out to students. There's lots of ways for us to share interactive data sites, which I think are so fun for the folks who like data, let alone just recommendations with some data to support those recommendations. There's a lot of different ways we could be sharing or reporting results out. And unfortunately, I think in some scenarios, we are very much attached to the way we've always done it. We've always had a summary report, so we're going to do a summary report. And those kinds of mechanisms can hamper what we can then end up having for impacts from those results. I think it's pretty clear that effective results can explain the project as much or as little as the audience might need, particularly because in some cases the report may be the only connection or contact that that audience member has with the assessment project. And in those situations, how we explain the project can build or undermine folks' confidence in the outcomes and the recommendations. And so it can be important to explain the project. But I think there's also some things like things need to be clear and easy to read. And when I say clear, I don't think it necessarily has to be, you know, written at the 5th grade reading level. But I think there are ways to get people's attention focused on the parts that they need to. And whether that's through formatting or even just, you know, creating a data tidbit rather than a full report, there's ways to make things clear and easy for the audience. And there's no question that 3rd bullet point that we've got to target our audiences. We have got to think about what does the audience want, need? What do they care about? What will they pay attention to? And really thinking through this whole linking of assessment results to audiences. And frankly, I know that myself and others have done entire presentations on how do we report effectively, what kinds of notions related to storytelling or other things can help us create reports that have an impact. And to really be thinking beyond kind of written reports and binders, or in addition to, or in combination with. There are definitely audiences who want the binder. No question, they're going to dig in. But there are other audiences that we need to think about other things that we can do to help them make sense of the data and make it linked to practice and to practical kinds of things that they do, and do that easily and quickly so that they're not discouraged, overwhelmed, put off by what they're looking at in terms of assessment. Okay, one more. Whew. I think that one of the final sort of pitfalls or missteps that we do in assessment is we fail to evaluate our own assessment projects. When we're rushing, when we're planning, when we're doing things, and when we're, frankly, trying to make links to practice, it's very easy to forget this last step. And I'm not saying that we have to do sort of in-depth evaluations of everything, but there are some sort of key questions that we should be asking ourselves about the assessment project and making note of, particularly if there's any possibility we're going to do this project or a related project again. So we should be asking ourselves, you know, what did we learn from doing this project? Not necessarily the assessment questions, but, you know, did we learn some stuff about focus groups? Did we learn some stuff about our students and their willingness to participate in assessment? Did we learn some stuff about what technology we have to do this kind of activity? Maybe we learned some stuff about ourselves and what we want to do and don't want to do for future assessment projects, motivation. You know, what worked well? What could be improved? What changes would I make if I were to do this project again? You know, would I do it exactly the same? Or are there follow-up questions I would have asked, or timing differences, whatever it may be? So it's that sense of taking the time to reflect so that we have some information that could guide our assessment practice. Right? You know, are we going to sort of reflect on things and say, you know what, our methodology choices aren't necessarily what we would do if we had it to do over? Or that what we learned through this project has now spawned some additional questions that might prompt a different methodology next time, meaning we're going to add some depth or some breadth so that we've learned the basics, now we want to learn something else. Are we going to make changes in something like, you know, location? Population that we're, you know, gathering information from or that we're sharing with? Maybe we need to think about, you know, what worked in terms of our reporting and what didn't. Did it get lost in a committee? Did the committee get focused on methodological choices? And what might that mean to what we do next time? And frankly, this sort of step, be it a short sort of little taking notes, quick committee conversation, whatever it may be, helps give these assessment projects new directions, and it also helps us see what we're missing. Sometimes we didn't ask a question that when I look at the data now, I go, oh, I wish I could know that now. I didn't know that was important, whatever it may be. So this evaluation step, which I have to say I think is one of the most overlooked steps in assessment, because we're already doing an evaluation. So to do an evaluation of the evaluation feels kind of weird. But this is how we build our expertise in assessment, which we talked about earlier, is so important. We have to reflect on this practice as well as we reflect on our others. So let me do a quick wrap up, because I've covered a lot of things that we misstep, that we kind of hit a pitfall, whatever word you want to use. And I want to kind of lay out a few takeaways, because there's no question that there's overlap between these, and there's no question that there's overlap between the strategies or the things that we need to do to avoid some of these common missteps, whatever you want to say. we need to be conducting assessment for the right reasons. So we need to understand that assessment is a tool that can make us better at what we're trying to do. And that's one of the reasons we're doing it. So even if we have to check a box to say that we're doing assessment and that's part of our program planning process or our evaluation steps or our grant, whatever, we also need to build in some other reasons to do assessment. So whether it's about learning about our students or learning about our practice, let's build in some of those right reasons for doing an assessment in addition to those kind of mandatory have-tos, right? One of the other big ones is using our resources and collaborating. This makes things so much easier. I don't know about you, but my to-do list is often fairly long, and having a collaborator can help me move this priority up the list, and it can help reduce the workload, and it adds those different perspectives, that additional expertise. There's almost no reason not to look at resources and look at collaborators and see what you can find. Even doing a quick skim of a website to just check your understanding of things. I still do that after 15 some odd years, where if we're getting ready to do something, it's fun sometimes to see what's the new wisdom about that method, or is there something new that I didn't know before? Even just to look at it and go, yeah, I'm still on track, I'm still on target. Taking the time to plan effectively and to kind of lay out some of those timelines, lay out some of those steps, who, what, why, and particularly the whys, and the purpose, and linking our assessments to the purpose. That's part of planning. And taking that extra step and doing some of that work up front actually makes these projects go easier. Even when it's rough, right? To kind of take that extra week or 2 or 3, or depending on what committees you've got going, 4 or 5 or 6 weeks to plan it well can make a huge difference in terms of its ultimate impact. And then sort of that last step of reporting results and really understanding that it's not just about getting the data out, it's about getting people to pay attention and to move. And that creates a different mindset for reporting. And then, of course, the slide you just saw 2 ago of being reflective on our assessment practice. So that was a lot of stuff about assessment and kind of assessment best practices and trying to be thoughtful and reflective about our assessment work. A couple things just so I don't forget, and Rhonda, you can jump in anytime too. I am on LinkedIn, so we are posting things like blogs. I don't think we post them on LinkedIn, but I post links to them. So if you want to see some of the things that we're writing about and talking about, don't hesitate to connect with me on LinkedIn. Watch our website for future content. That can be anything from research notes to connections to some of the blogs to even information about webinars. And our next webinar actually is about a month from now. It's February 23rd, and it's going to be about non-traditional students. And one of my research managers, Matt Venice, is going to do this. I'm really excited about this one because he's going to be talking about some of the conversation I think that is going on in higher ed, which is sort of the growing recognition of non-traditionals, but also the diversity of definitions of non-traditionals. Oftentimes we throw the word out and we have an image of in our heads of what we might mean by non-traditionals, but there's a lot of different definitions for a non-traditional student, and how we think about those definitions can absolutely impact the conversation that we have about non-traditionals. So I think that'll be a great webinar. Rhonda, did you want to do the company stuff, or do you want me to?
I'll have you do that if you don't mind. And I do have a question that someone had asked, so whenever you would like to get to that would be great.
Well, why don't we, well, let's do this. Let's have any questions that people have, go ahead and type them in. I'll do the company stuff while people are typing, and then we can hit a couple questions before we hit the hour mark. Just a couple things so that if you're not familiar with our company, we are Sky Factor, formerly EBI MapWorks. EBI, if you know us, we are dedicated to helping colleges and universities really improve retention, success, and the quality of the student experience. So it's about quality improvement to us, and that kind of evolutionary nature of improvement. We have easy-to-use hosted software solutions. They are research-based and rigorously tested. Hopefully you hear some of that in the way that I talk and the experience that we have, and that is what's underlying a lot of the work that we do. We have impeccable client services and support folks kind of helping our clients work through things. To give you some kind of big sense of what we have kind of two big branches to the work that we do. One is a student success and retention system. It's MapWorks. It absolutely has a research practical methodology that sets us apart. It is adaptable, affordable, accurate predictive models that help predict student success and retention that are customizable. And we're providing critical insights that are delivered to the user's desktop and continuously. We also offer comprehensive consulting services on that side of things. On the other side of things is SkyFactor's Benchworks. And what these are is academic and student affairs assessments, and so they make program assessment easy. We've got peer benchmarking built in, as well as longitudinal comparisons. They are aligned with professional and accreditation standards. So if you're in an academic discipline like nursing, they are aligned to AACN as well as other standards. If you're on the student affairs side of things, they're aligned to things like CAS standards or ACUHO-I standards. And there's some really great prescriptive, insightful kinds of reporting built into the system, well beyond the standard means and standard deviations, but some regression results and crosstabs and all kinds of interesting things. Here's our website. So let's do questions.
Okay, at what point does assessment become research, and how do we take this extra step given the expectation of evidence-based practices, and can assessment contribute to the literature on student success?
Great question. There's no question that assessment and research have overlap, and there's no question that methodologically and other ways that they play in. And I don't know about you, but when I was doing a graduate program, we had applied research classes, and part of that was probably education. So applied research and that kind of approach feels a lot like assessment, and I don't think there's any doubt that matters. Fundamentally, if you were to take an academic approach to it, the difference between assessment and kind of research is contributing to this greater body of knowledge. So if you think about something like student retention or learning, there's this, brick wall of all the knowledge. And when you get ready to do a dissertation or a research article, you try to find the brick that's missing and you try to fit it into that broader theoretical construct of research, right? You're filling that niche. And there's no question on the assessment sort of practical research side, you're trying to affect and collect information that's going to affect day-to-day practice. And so there's definitely a slightly different approach, a slightly different question set. But there's also no question that there's overlap. Because if I am very focused on the practical nature and how students learn and what students learn, that might create a brick for that brick wall of broader knowledge. Right? I may learn something about how students learn about diversity in an assessment project that could have broader implications than just my program, just my campus, and just my students. Now, that is not to say that my assessment project tells everybody how they should do that kind of practice, but there's no question there's a relationship there, and there's no question that assessment projects can create research articles, research findings, if you place them in that framework of greater knowledge and fitting them in. So I don't know if I'm exactly answering your question, but they're absolutely related. There's absolutely a skill set for both. What I see is that people who come from kind of one side or the other, practice or research, who haven't had enough of the overlap, bring that perspective. So the true researchers often bring those research questions that have value, but we have to make sure that there's a practical value to assessment as well. And sometimes the really practical folks with that sort of expertise and background bring those really great practical questions that may be really tough research questions. And so we've got to kind of marry the two perspectives to get really good assessment and or assessment that has broader implications. So I don't know if that helped, but I think you're kind of on the right track of thinking about that. There's no question that sometimes our assessment is more simplistic, and it can feel more simplistic. That does not let us off the hook in terms of doing quality methods. So hopefully that helped. Any other questions, Rhonda?
No, I don't see any. Let me just check again the chat box real quick. No?
Okay. Lovely. So we're recording this. They'll get the recording, and I think we're done 5 minutes early, unless somebody types quickly.
Yeah. That sounds good. Well, again, we want to thank everyone so much for their time. And Sherry, thank you so much for all this great information. It's really, really interesting.
No problem. Everybody have a great day. I hope nobody's too buried in snow today. Or if they are, it'll melt soon. So, okay, have a good one. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.